Ben Yeoh is a senior portfolio manager of global equities, and he is a playwright. Ben, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
All right. So, the title or the goal of this podcast series is to introduce to investors what the long-term benefits are derived by investing in ESG-related initiatives. Ben, you are, I would consider, a thought leader in this space. You have a lot of activity in different areas, but you also have you're sitting at the intersection of two different worlds. One is investing and one is theater. So I want to take a step back and learn some history about you, Ben. How did those two areas arise in your life?
Great. So I'm just going to preface it with a little bit of good compliance, just to say there's no organizational endorsement here, no investment advice, all of that type of stuff. And this is personal views only. Obviously, it's mixing the kind of personal and business and investment interests. And with that over, I'd say my journey started, I guess, in high school or secondary school, as we'd say here, which actually is just down the road in Westminster, London. I was born a Londoner. And I trained in science. So I went to undergraduate at Cambridge, did some more science, neuroscience and experimental psychology, got a scholarship to Harvard, where I then actually did more neuroscience, but also started in a kind of liberal arts idea of learning how to do playwriting, poetry, sculpture, all of those type of things as well as having done theatre at Cambridge. And so when I started, and I always had a lot of interest, and so when I started in my job in the world of investments, I kind of started a dual career also in terms of arts, because I still fundamentally believed that art's impact had the power to change the world for the better. How humanity always still does things like dance and art and has done for a very long time, and that can lead to a lot of cultural change. But also actually believe that business and investment could also be a force for good. And then back quite early on in my career, around about the 2002, 2003 mark, I've done a lot of specialism within healthcare. And I was involved then with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and then NGOs, asset managers, asset owners, and pension funds around HIV drug pricing in Africa. And there was a lot of talk, or in a lot of the developing world. And there was a lot of talk there around how pharmaceutical companies didn't understand why these other stakeholders were perceiving them as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I was very much involved in some of those stakeholder dialogues. And at that point, it really crystallized to me that you needed to be integrated in your thinking. It was useless just pulling out some of these single metrics, whether that would be just one profit line or one environmental line or one X, Y, and Z line. You needed to think in an integrated fashion because the world was complex and intersectional. And from that, I started what we would now think of as an integrated ESG or an integrated sustainability practice within my investment work.
What does integrated mean in this context?
Well, in this context, it means dealing with all of the various factors which drive, say, businesses and societies, and looking them in the long-term factors and looking them all together rather than siloing them out, not really analyzing the interdependent nature of a lot of these things. Businesses rely on their customers, they rely on social contracts, all of this type of thing. They will use resources from the environment. They have relationships with regulators and governments. So all of those factors come together. And integrated here really means that you have to think about all of them. Ideally, we think that the decision maker who's thinking about them does better assessment for these long-term viabilities. That's from the investment side. It's also the same for the company side, because you can think of that business model. If they don't take into account all of these stakeholders, and we might get onto the notion of purpose, maybe through the lens of their purpose or what they're trying to achieve, then if they're not showing enough net benefit really to parts of society, what actually capitalism or regulators do is they make you go bankrupt. If you're not providing benefit, customers are the only people who give you money, you've got no more revenue, and you don't exist. The intersection with arts comes about, as I was saying, because of this feeling that arts can really also impact the world and culture. And you can see that actually because there's arts impact funds. So there's, for instance, a really interesting fund here based out of the UK by Nesta, who believe that actually arts impact investing can make a difference between investment and sustainability. But from my practice, I very much thought that learnings from the art world, who tend to talk in a different language, have different factors which they believe are important or things which drive them, a somewhat different purpose, has a lot to teach other parts of the world, like business world and companies. And similarly, business world planning, thinking about things like cash flow or through the metrics of that metric of different purpose, could actually have a lot to teach arts world and other things. And because I had written plays, because I'd worked with organizations which had gone through national government funding, Arts Council, England funding, and had spoken that language and understood that, and because I was responsible for several $1 billion of clients' money through pension funds and had done investment and company, it was pointed out to me in several discussions with colleagues and friends that I was sort of uniquely placed to try and bring those worlds together, and that actually there might be quite a lot of learnings from that. That was also influenced by readings I'd done. There's a book sort of centering around some of this by Gillian Tett, who is an FT journalist, but has a social anthropological background. And she did it more from the business lens, but also pointed out that breaking down these silos was a very interesting way of getting answers to sometimes very complex solutions. So that's where this idea of kind of mixing a little bit of arts and business thinking comes together.
So you were talking about the factors or the interdependencies, right? Is that where this integration comes from? Looking at all of the interdependencies of one company and their suppliers or their vendors. Is that what it means?
Yes, I think it is one meaning of it. I think when we use the term now, integrated ESG, it's a sort of shorthand for environment, social, governance, and people within ESG world kind of know what you're talking about. But it's interesting, when I talk to any of my arty friends or something else, it doesn't really make necessarily very intrinsic sense. And actually, when you think about it, the governance function of companies is quite separate from environment and actually quite separate from society or social. And social can split to employees, society stakeholders, regulators and governments. So when we're coining that phrase and from its history, we are looking at all of these other factors. Some people call them non-financial. Other people don't like the term non-financial because it suggests that it's not important to a business, because if it's going to be important, it will be showing up in the numbers. So that's a valid argument as well, although it's a descriptor. Some people use the word extra financial to get to the beyond financial things, but they do that. Others don't like that term either. Some people use the word pre-financial because it's something which happens before financials. Some people use ESG. Some people have used this concept of triple bottom line reporting, which again is similar, that you can report on your profit, you can report on your people, and you can report on your planet, on your environment. That was coined in the 1990s. Actually, the originator was probably John Elkington and his consulting group. So there is all of this, but it's really trying to get at this idea is that there is quite a lot of different factors to companies and to this world. And looking at them all together is a way of doing it. I would also say some of it then you can be reflected in what we call integrated reporting, which is a reflection of some of these integrated factors. And in fact, there is a movement within standard setters and reporting to do that. I think interested listeners can look at the Integrated Reporting Council and that work. And they look at that actually also from an integrated point of view. And they talk about different forms of capital. It's a kind of very Anglo-Saxon way of thinking about it, but asset capitals as well as having financial capital. They think about human capital, social and relationship capital, manufacturing capital, intellectual capital, environmental and natural resources capital, as well as financial capital. I think I might have mentioned that one already. But so all of those capitals are a kind of integrated way or integrated lens way of thinking and reported. And that's kind of what the notion of where we're going to think about it in terms of an integrated sense. And that you can't, all of those capitals, you have to rely on one or other of those things in order to drive your business or society and things like that forward.
Yeah. So you wrote a book of aphorisms. Where did the idea for that come from, and where did the content for that come from?
So actually, original idea was I was inspired by a friend, Rishi Dastidar, who wrote a set of poetic aphorisms. And in poetry world, there is a little movement which expresses a poetic language through an aphoristic way. Aphorisms being these short, pithy statements which summarize a viewpoint of the world, or sometimes a sort of poetic language. So there was a poetic work working through aphorisms, which has a long history. Arguably, you could go back to ideas such as Japanese haiku or even Buddhist koans, and you would say actually those look like aphorisms, poetic or philosophic. There are also a philosopher tradition actually of aphorisms, which go back, in fact, Nassim Taleb, the risk philosopher who's written Black Swan and others, he has a set of aphorisms in that tradition. You can go back just a few decades to Wittgenstein, who's got a very famous set of aphorisms, which are still very influential in moral philosophy world. And in fact, there is a tradition of that. And you can then go actually all the way back to the Greeks, ancient Greeks, always as you do. And Hippocrates, who is famous for his Hippocratic oath in terms of the medical profession, actually wrote the first set of what would be defined aphorisms, defining them as the aphorismi, although arguably you would have had it in Buddhist and other thought, but at least in the Western tradition, he coined that. So that was from a kind of philosopher tradition. So putting that all together, and Rishi's work himself was inspired by these 95 theorems or aphorisms, which started off the Reformation by Luther the First. So all of that put together, I thought, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And then I myself, over the last 20 years or so, had collected some of my own thoughts in terms of writing and thinking and investment thinking. And I thought, well, I might have around 95 of these, so I might maybe put them together. Obviously, a lot of this it's quite hard to have super original thought, and a lot of these aphorisms will be plays on other things or notes that I've heard, but I've kind of collated themselves myself and tried to make my own variants on things that you might have heard. And yes, although they are pointed towards investments, as the nature of aphorisms, sometimes they're a little bit opaque, and sometimes they really just talk about life views or philosophical points.
Yeah. Well, I enjoy the book. It's called, well, actually, so on the front also. Well, that's the back, I guess. This brings up another point. You have it in front of us. Then Do Better is your blog. What's the name from, and what is the goal of the blog?
Yeah, so the goal of the blog, I guess, is this intersectionality that I was talking about in terms of art and investment and all of that, which I'll talk about. I just thought I probably should remember on the investment aphorisms, and part of the blog is it was also partly written, well, in fact, fully written to help sponsor a charity that I'm very close to for Saturday Club for Autistic Children. So actually, I'm not making any profits or anything from that. I thought, okay, do this. That's a good way of getting people to think about that and raise a little bit of money for charity. So then do better. The phrase comes from this notion of if you want to do better, then do better, as opposed to if you want to do better, just sit around and complain about it, and therefore nothing changes. And I guess that's a kind of riff on what I think was attributed maybe to Gandhi, but I'm not sure he actually said this, about this idea of be the change that you want to be. There's no point just sitting around complaining. And part of the idea, I guess, of the blog is around about 7, 10, 12 years ago now, I used to keep a personal theatre blog. And at that time, it in hindsight, was probably might be considered the golden age of blogging. So I don't think Twitter had even quite been invented yet. Instagram wasn't around. Facebook was. But there was this notion that you had these personal expressions of ideas in blog, and there was a kind of blogosphere thing. Blogger was about, doesn't really happen anymore, on that. And so when I left the blogging world and pretty much left social media and all of that about 7 to 10 years ago, and then when I looked back, and I'd been off a lot of these social media platforms, and I kind of came back, and it wasn't what I expected it to be. It was very noisy, quite divisive, and didn't seem to reflect, first of all, the content that I wanted to read about, although I've subsequently found that a lot of it might actually more be on podcast rather than on written blogs. And not only was it not the content, it wasn't really a reflection of the people that I met, the hundreds of people that I meet every year, cities, countries around the world, either involved in business or involved in the arts, which wasn't at the kind of noisy 10% extremes of what you hear on Twitter with very divisive and polarized and non-evidence views and beliefs. But it was a lot of people that I would say maybe 80 or 90% people in the middle working on common purposes, common goals, maybe different ways of approaching it, but actually quite a lot aligned. And these conversations, like the ones we're having now, although I'm aware I'm talking a lot on it, but like the ones we're having now, where actually you had a lot of reflections, you had new ideas from new ways of thinking, and people wanting to progress things. And in fact, humanity has progressed very far in the last 50 to 100 years, although with a lot of challenges. You can see this in Hans Rosling's work with a recent book he's done on factfulness about how far we've come. So I thought through this line of practice, there's no point just complaining about it. If there is no content that you want to read or see, then actually you should create that content. And obviously I had been a writer and a playwright and all of these things. So I thought, okay, well, there's no point doing that. You have to do that. There is also another little thing here from a writing strand, because there's a big school of thought within the writing tradition, and this intersects with, I would say, I guess, the diversity movements that you see around the world, which is that if you don't see what you want to see on film and stage, then you need to write those stories that you put on. And there's a big movement to try and get the stories which aren't told onto our screens, our stages, our books, and things like that. Obviously, you need to have people empowered with the skills to write and put on those, and there's a whole debate and times about that. But if you are in a position where you can maybe tell some of those stories or some of those themes or a reflection of the world that you're seeing, which you're not seeing reflected in the content that you are otherwise taking in, then maybe you should do something about it. And I did feel a little bit of a responsibility that actually you can't just be passive. If you have that ability to share this type of knowledge or this type of thinking, this type of intersectionality stuff, and saying, actually, no, there are good people working on good things and this is it, then you should be creating that content. Hence, then do better, and hence the multi-strand nature of where that is.
Was the mingle an outgrowth of that then do better philosophy of taking action?
Yes. So I guess they started around about the same time. I thought, well, blog and content, you need to have something that you're talking about or you're expressing views about the world or arts particularly, and some on sustainable investment. But then because of that reaction of what I was hearing or seeing on social media and the like, I thought actually you needed to bring this to a real world thing. I since discovered that there are these things like meetups, which happen, and there's a whole meetup group. But the interesting thing about meetups is they tend to be within silo. You have some where you're kind of like, let's meet up and explore London and things like that, which are a little bit more cross. But you tend to have like a tech meetup or a sustainability meetup or something like that, which are really good and is a good way of information sharing and things like that. But I was interested in this cross-siloed multidisciplinary effort because a lot of the problems I was seeing were and are complex, and we're going to need more than one type of solution and type of thinking. I think it is oversimplistic to rely on one single strand or one simplistic strand to solve this. So I thought, well, I'm meeting all of these people from arts world or from business world, from sustainability world, from policy, left, right, up, down, libertarian, authoritarian, all of that. But bringing them together to start off these conversations, I certainly don't have all of the answers or even any of the answers to these solutions. But some of these people might do, or some of these people might do in that meeting. So I thought it was quite important to have that real world meeting, because I think what we do to each other or the conversations we have in real life are still different to what we do online or on social media. It does seem to be very different spheres, and so those real world meetups are still important.
So I'm going to tie this back to ESG now. Well, I guess it's all about ESG, but so I'm from the U.S. U.S. is a little bit behind Europe, I would say, in the push towards ESG. Although we're getting there slowly but surely. Are there some? How do you think? What's your perspective on the global action taking towards making or solving these global challenges related to ESG?
Wow, so deceptively simple question with quite a complex answer, because there are different geographical differences: US, Japan,
And why
China,
might those be?
Europe, which actually have cultural roots. But maybe let's start with two or three of the biggest ones and a kind of very short potted history of maybe why we are where we are. So the movement, I guess, on a kind of social responsibility within investments is actually very, very old. You can actually go back maybe a couple of thousand years or even longer. And in fact, you could even argue from a social anthropological view, humanity thinking about this is one of the areas which maybe distinguishes us for some animals. So there's evidence, for instance, that Neanderthals, Homo Neanderthal or whatever their term is, around about Homo sapiens, looked after their disabled. So you have elderly, disabled Neanderthals, you could see, were buried at an old age, so they were looked after in society. So there's a kind of deep human roots. Fast forward tens of thousands of years, in the 1700s, when you had the start of humanity kind of thinking that slavery wasn't the way that it wanted to go, you had the start of the fair trade movement, when you had objects which were blazoned with these ideas that these were not made by slaves. So that was part of their branding and promotion, and you might have had to pay more to get those objects because you were going to be part of an anti-slavery movement. So then maybe go back about 50 years, even in a global context, and you had a lot of, I would say, mission-aligned and faith-based organizations who were kind of thinking, well, we only want to invest in a certain way, which invests along the way that we think about the world. And the first expression was in a lot of exclusionary ideas around about investment, which today the term tends to be socially responsible investment or exclusion mandate. So there is a lot of confusion about the terminology. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that maybe we didn't want to invest in tobacco, or maybe we didn't want to invest in companies which made landmines and that type of thing. So that was started around post-war 1950s, 1960s with that type of movement. At the same point in time, essentially along came Milton Friedman. Mm-hmm. He's a very famous US economist, and he was very, very influential, particularly in the US. So this is where one of the dichotomies starts to happen between the US and the rest of the world. He's very influential globally, but still probably the strongest expression of that in the US. And his book, Capitalism and Freedom, very, very influential, still taught in Econ 101 and will be in business schools around the world today globally. And within it, it probably has the idea that he epitomizes that the only social purpose of a company is profit. I feel kind of bad that I'm actually now talking about that, so still propagating that view. But that was a very, very strong view. It's written of its time. You also had to understand that there was this sort of thought that maybe you should, if you were using a company's profits for your own personal charitable work, that wasn't on. There's a lot of moral philosophy between the split between owners of business and managers of business, which goes all the way back to Adam Smith, mm-hmm. joint stock companies, and how the modern corporation has come about. But essentially, because that was such a strong line of thinking in the US, only profit, which has probably evolved into only maximizing shareholder value, a somewhat nebulous concept as well, but as epitomized, tends to be through share price, and you can talk about that as short-term or long-term share price. But because Milton Friedman was quite influential, you had the US quite fixated on that profit metric as the way of saying, okay, this is where shareholder value has got to. But in more recent times, I guess starting in the 1990s, and I alluded to this earlier, there was this concept of trip and bottom line accounting coming through. And this is this idea that actually there are other things other than profits which might be really important for business. Interestingly, even if you go back to Milton Friedman's original work, he wouldn't really disagree with businesses doing things like promoting their brand in the community, if that's adding to brand value, which then adds to profit as well. So in a kind of closer read of Friedman, you get quite a lot of intersectionality, that a lot of stuff which is good for your employees, good for your customers, would also be good for profit. So you kind of have this kind of stakeholder model of capitalism developed, which is not necessarily that at odds with some interpretations of Friedman, because investing in a lot of these other assets, human capital, intellectual capital, social relationship capital, all of these type of things would be of benefit. And obviously, say in extremis, if you don't have a planet to operate on, then obviously you don't have a business and you have no profit. So a lot of it might be intersectional of that, although academics will still debate it. And therefore you have now these expressions of let's look at the E and the S or the triple bottom line away from, say, the exclusionary mandates, and how are we looking at all of these type of things in a kind of overall accounting on how might businesses do well. But I will go on. So there's been now recent, I guess, more thoughts or criticism saying, well, that's still through the profit lens. And is this really what the original thoughts about the purpose of business was? Kind of almost going back to Adam Smith or things that predate Milton Friedman, because there are these observations, which are still widely debated about, well, why is it that our bottom 60% don't seem to be doing so well? There's been interesting analysis by, quite well thought of, say, hedge fund or investment people. So Warren Buffett has said some things about this. Ray Dalio has done some very interesting work on this bottom 60%. And obviously there's lots of arguments and back and forth about the status of inequality or things like that. But they're saying, okay, maybe the system isn't necessarily working for everyone. How does that really express itself or not? And so there's now been some really interesting work around this notion of purpose. And in fact, you can also argue, implementation or not, but Larry Fink's very recent letter from BlackRock this year has purpose front and center. It's just come out actually at the end of January 2019. So there is this thought, and you've had 2 or 3 lines of inquiry on this. Here in the UK, you have a think tank called the Purposeful Company, which is doing quite a lot of work on this. And you've had a recent book from Professor Colin Meyer, who was, I think, the head of the Oxford Business School, the Said Business School there, but actually very well distinguished academic, in a book entitled Prosperity, but is looking at this. And it's this notion that actually, if you look at the history of where business was, they usually came around a purpose. Now, that purpose might be something like selling the best widget possible, or saying best communications, or it might be something to do with healthcare. And you had a lot of things which would be triple bottom line or ESG or around that, but it was solidified around a purpose. And you might have had loose associations of people coming together to help solve or really fulfill that purpose. And I guess there's lines of arguments that maybe we should be looking through some more purposeful forms of organization or business, which through that profit flows, because you are fulfilling your purpose very well. And it's actually subtly different from just looking at various stakeholders and things like that, by going back to a slightly higher order thing about looking at purpose. So we're getting all the way there, and this is kind of quite a complex look at that. At the same point in time, you've also got, at one end of the spectrum, when I was talking about this is how you've got integrated ESG away from exclusionary mandate, you've also got people who are looking at what we would call impact investing. And this is sort of investing where we're kind of thinking, can we make a social or environmental or other impact? And a lot of that impact investing is now seen through the lens of, say, these UN social development goals, but this idea that there is a certain set of goals or factors that quite a lot of humanity has agreed upon would be a really good idea. And can we make measurements or things which impact those measurements, along with can we make profit from that? Are they kind of co-primary? Can we measure those two things along? Is that the kind of thing that we can do? Impact investors themselves also have ongoing debates as to where they sit in all of that.
Do you think there's a geographic divide regarding which country is more advanced in their impact investing? Because like I said, the U.S. is a little bit behind Europe, maybe because of Milton Friedman. I don't know, or maybe it was did Keynes, who I would consider to be Milton Friedman's kind of a counterpart in the U.K. Did he have any proclivity towards more progressive ESG stance or anything like that?
I guess he was a generation behind, really.
Was
So the influence is less felt. And I don't really have any formal economist training, so I wouldn't take you through the history of economy. But my reading of it, and you can ask academics, is Friedman is very influential in the US, still on global, but has a more US sense. And there you have it through that. They are very suspicious of anything, and even metrics and things around that, and also their regulation and litigious society, which aren't metrics, which don't impact a profit or a financial metric later on. Do we have geographic differences around impact investing? In fact, we haven't talked about Japan, which I think is different in China again. Well, probably a lot of the leading players within impact investing are global in nature themselves, actually. Some of them are US headquartered. So I'm not certain that you necessarily say the organizations interested in impact are there. They tend to be more developed world and things. And maybe by their nature, they tend to have been supported by endowments and foundations and misaligned owners of assets and capital as well. But there's a real split within impact, I guess, where there is a strand of impact investors who would really say that although you can get your money back and maybe get some sort of return, you can't get a market rate return, or really a risk-adjusted market rate return, although that's somewhat in debate, as in you can't really measure the risk very well on these type of things versus traditional VC, venture capital, or private equity. And some impact investors who say, no, you can get a market rate of return and also make impact. So the people who argue that you wouldn't really be able to make a market rate return is because they would say they're investing in things which are pre-commercial ready and are taking other risks, and because they're getting other outputs like poor female access to finance in a country such as India or a lesser developed country like that. And if you're going to really solve that, you're not going to get the same market rates of return. So much so that actually I think kind of middle of the road, people suggest that maybe there are some impact investments which can get market rate returns, and maybe some impact investments which don't make market rate returns. I think there's that. But it is still actually heavily contested. Probably if you want to read about a nexus who think you're probably not going to get market rate returns, you could look at Sumerian Partners and their type of work. And if you wanted to look at the work which do think you can get a return, there's a couple of foundations here, I guess through the tonic work.
TONIIC, right?
TONIIC, yes. So yes, I will just put those two views out there. My reading of it, no side has particularly won, and maybe the truth is sometimes you can and sometimes you don't, which I guess is true of all investments.
So how would institutional investor, how should they approach looking at, or if they haven't invested in any sort of ESG type of investment, right? I don't know if that's even how you say it, but if they haven't considered this, why is it something to be considered?
Okay, so if we're talking about standard ESG, of which we've noted there's a little bit of debate on this, but this is looking at the factors, environmental, social, governance, and stewardship, which might impact a business for the future. I think there's a huge series of arguments of why this is really important. Maybe if you start up the investment chain, the man in the street, the ultimate beneficiary of a lot of these investments, his or her pension fund, those trustee people, they're increasingly asking for the professionals who are looking after their money on their behalf to take account of these type of factors. Whether this is climate change, maybe through the Me Too diversity movement, the ultimate beneficiary is saying, actually, this is important to us. And across a lot of jurisdictions, what the customer, what the client wants is always at the top of the tree. You can see this then, say, in surveys of what millennials think about this type of investing, also what females think about this type of investing, and where those trends are. So that's really a customer service-led type of thing. You need to give your customer what they want you can argue about whether that's a good thing. You can argue about whether you're going to give someone a full balanced meal. If they want a vegan meal, they have a perfect right to choose a vegan meal, even if their dietitian thinks actually veganism doesn't seem to make sense. I'm not saying it does. It doesn't. It's one of those things. Couldn't be vegans like I only want to eat fish for the rest of my life. Perfectly your choice. Then when you come into the investment world, I think there's 2 or 3 strands of evidence here. So one is there's quite a lot of academic work in favor of this in terms of this integrated ESG aspect. Academics are still arguing about it. You do have positives and negatives on it. There is a definitional argument on that because some academics are still looking at this in what I would call the exclusionary SRI. The ratings and the data on ESG metrics, when I talk about ESG overall, is still somewhat not adequate. But if you look at very specific lenses, so for instance, Professor Alex Edmonds have looked at the intangibles of employee satisfaction. That would have to be considered a non-financial metric or extra financial metric, I guess. Probably falls under S, social, your employees. He has shown that it adds to both accounting metrics and things like profit and productivity, as well as stock price. In that sense, you could say it's a pre-financial metric because it's impacting that. And he's actually shown that there is alpha, what we would call alpha, so extra risk-adjusted return associated with that metric. So although you can't argue about the whole of ESG, you can look at it through, say, just that S metric, and that's pretty strong academic evidence just for one particular factor within that makeup. Then actually you could look at the work of Professor Caroline Flammer. You can Google it, Flammer's work, where she has looked at a lot of governance and CSR type of proposals. And there's a technique that you can use, comes out of the academic literature, on regression discontinuity analysis. And that analysis, which is a semi-natural causal experiment, again has shown that long-termism, either via incentives or via these proposals, seem to have better effects on terms of accounting profit metrics as well as stock price in the future. So there's a kind of academic line of work saying actually you're going to make more money from this. Then there's another line of work which I guess is a little bit more also semi-theoretical and where we're at, which has looked at the fact that a lot of companies' values today are embodied in what we would call its intangible assets. So these are the assets that you can't really touch. And I kind of talked about a lot of them earlier: human capital, intellectual capital, manufacturing capital, all of those things. Actually, manufacturing, some of it you can touch. And I think the key book in this area, which came out at the end of 2017, is by Jonathan Haskell and Stian Westlake. Haskell is now sitting on the UK's monetary policy committee setting interest rates. Stian Westlake is working as a government policy advisor. And their book, which is Capitalism Without Capital, really takes a really good look at this. And what they show is that it does seem to be that a lot of the company's value is in these intangibles. And if you look at these intangibles, they often split out into things like how good are your people, how good is your brand, your reputational capital, and things like that. And some of the lines of evidence shows that it might be 80 or 90% of the value today in many companies, say in the S&P 500, isn't in that intangible value. And a lot of that intangible value doesn't really appear on the balance sheet. Moreover, I would argue that there are a lot of management teams today which overborrow from one of these sources of capital. So it's not quite like overborrowing from the bank, but you can borrow from the environment by not cleaning up after yourself. You can borrow from the future by cutting R&D. You borrow from your regulator by playing fast and loose with the rules. You can borrow from your employees by cutting staff and training and development budgets. The irony of all of those overborrowings is that your near-term profit, as measured by cash in your P&L, actually goes up. So imagine you cut staff and training. Imagine all of the salaries in this organization will cut 20%. Well, that goes through to your near-term profit line. In that quarter, in that year, you're going to report higher cash profits through your P&L statement. But I don't think your employees are going to be very happy. And in fact, most of them can't leave you that next week. Life doesn't work like that. But if they now get a call from a recruiter, from a headhunter, next year you're going to lose quite a lot of your best staff probably, and you're going to find it really hard to re-recruit them, because it's not like people don't know that that's happened. So what you've done is you've taken a short-term action for long-term, so the value destruction. So what you really want is short-term pain for long-term gain. This has been the opposite. You've done short-term gain and you've created long-term pain. So if you see that through the eyes of all of this other capital, whether you want to call it ESG, intangible, non-financial, extra-financial, pre-financial, all of this type of stuff, it's kind of considered really important. It does hit all of the profit metrics. So actually, that probably would align with what Milton Friedman said in any case. It doesn't necessarily hark back to purpose, although purpose could really help you drive all of these things. So really, if you sort of sum it up, your clients are asking for it. It seems to make sense from a company and business view. And there's a lot of evidence that these kind of integrated ESG toolbox should help you analyze companies better, and therefore, at least from a fundamental point of view, you should be able to get a better risk return out of it.
You mentioned this overborrowing concept. Is there any harbinger when you say you walk into a company, right? Is there any harbinger to say, oh, these guys are overborrowing, that's just very blatant, or is it something that is observed over time?
Really, there's a huge mixture, company and sector specific. Sometimes they're observations, sometimes you can pick it up in the accounts, sometimes you can pick it up in essentially outside employee survey measures like Glassdoor or something like that. So I wouldn't want to necessarily point you to one thing. And then you can see the framework that I was mentioning before of those, say, if you use it through those various capitals or those various stakeholders, you could see it through an employee lens, a supplier lens, a customer lens, a natural capital lens. But obviously there are trade-offs. So maybe if you are getting better agreements with your suppliers, you can be providing better value to your customers. But if you ding your suppliers too much, or you don't have a partnership with them, and that goes wrong, then it can all unravel, might you see within supermarkets. So it's kind of complex, and that's why, and partly this goes back to our earlier conversation about intersectionality of some of these. Some of these things you can't just pull out as one thread. It is integrated, which is coming back to this notion of integrated. So I sometimes have a little bit of a joke, because I'm sometimes asked how much of what you do is integrated ESG, or how much of it is this, and I go, this is a little bit like asking whether light is a wave or a particle. The answer is yes, because the point is that it's integrated. And so when you're an integrated particle, wave and light, depends how you're seeing it, depends on that, is very difficult to unentangle. Businesses are made out of all of this. It's kind of this amazing thing that you bring financial capital, human capital, all of these other capitals together, money and ideas make more than the sum of the parts.
Looking at that the other way around, and then I want to get to these quick fire questions. Are there any recommendations you have for companies that are trying to be more ESG focused, that are like cultural institutions they can start working on at their companies? Any ideas?
Again, there's a lot of debate as to that, and I do think it will be set upon the board and the senior management to set these kind of things. I wouldn't want to be, I'm kind of careful not to be prescriptive on this. Sure. Some people have used UN SDG lenses. This is why, though, I've mentioned purpose, because it can be quite interesting to set the lens through purpose. So if you take a company like Microsoft, they've actually set purpose differently under Bill Gates, under Steve Ballmer, the next CEO, and under Satya Nadella through that. And if you look at it through the lens of purpose, then some of these other things flow. But I would say that boards and senior management, they should know, or in fact they do know, the long-term factors which make their business model sustainable in the holistic sense of the word, stronger in 5 years or 10 years time, 20 years, 50 years time than today. And those goals and metrics which are important to them, they should be able to outline and ascertain, and then they can drive them through their business. If you're a healthcare business, if you're not saving people's lives, making people's lives better, or saving the healthcare system money, or all of the above in terms of value, I think it might be difficult. If you are a media content company, the healthcare lens may be less important, although obviously the health and welfare of your employees, if all your employees are sick or undernourished and things like that, then obviously you're not going to have a business there. So I do think it is still important to see it through a company lens, an organizational lens. And so even if you look at the UN SDGs, there are over 100 targets sitting below that. Not all of those will be company responsibilities, or indeed you would want companies to take them on. The lens might not be there, but it is kind of an interesting starting point from some of those conversations. And I know a lot of the companies in the world are having these type of conversations, and these are the lenses that they can look through.
Okay. Thank you for these questions. Answer. Thanks for the questions, Ben. I want to move to these quick fire questions, and then we will wrap. So the first one is, and we were talking about this earlier, what's your preferred, these are just going to be very simple questions, preferred method of commuting?
Preferred method of commuting is public transport, or walking maybe.
Okay. How far do you walk when you walk?
I try and walk maybe, I don't want like super amounts, but maybe 20, 30 minutes a day, that sort of order. So this would be the funny thing. I don't drive, so I don't have a driving license. I have a provisional driving license because it's useful for ID checks. But yeah, maybe I'm kind of thinking that I'm 50 years ahead of my time. I'm waiting for autonomous, renewable electric vehicles powered to a renewable grid.
These days you don't need to drive much. You got Uber if you need a car. It's easy enough.
Maybe in London, yeah.
So the second one, what is your favorite app to use?
Favorite app to use? Well, we're going to answer this from a different question. Having come back on social media about 2 years ago, just this week, I deleted my Twitter and Facebook apps because I've been very influenced by Tim Hartford recently, who said you've got to kind of take back control of your technology. I'll probably still look into the website, so I've deleted that. Most recently, I have started experimenting using Slack, which people might know about as a sort of multi-user thing, because I'm collaborating with someone who's currently in Singapore and then Australia on a kind of performance lecture writing piece. And so I'm trialing that out. And so that might be interesting. I don't really know how that would go.
Okay, so Slack. The next one is, and this comes from another podcast I listened to. What item of 100 pounds or less has most impacted your life in the last year?
A tricky one. One which comes to mind, there might be a few, but one which comes to mind is going to or using a bullet journal, as well as all the other ways of that I record information and notes. And I guess this is a practice from where I've had from quite young, that actually keeping some sort of notebook on you, I think is a really useful way of just recording ideas or thoughts, or particularly observations, if you write from an observational viewpoint. And I had been, like a lot of people, just like tapping things out on phone and all of that. But I've discovered, at least in my own practice, there is still something for writing things down, or even little doodles or drawings. So I did art A-level at high school, and one of the practice there is you always keep an art notebook. And so I've gone back to that, and that was only in the last year. Obviously, a journal is only £10. This bullet journaling kind of thing has got a little movement behind it. I'm not sure I use all of the bullet journal type stuff, but certainly a notebook has been quite impactful.
Okay. What media, whether that's a book or I know you said don't listen to podcasts, that's fine, maybe documentary or TV series, has most changed your opinion on something?
Something that has most changed my opinion on something. I would say of recent times, I read a book by Andrew Solomon where the main title, I think, is Far from the Tree, or Falling Far from the Tree. It's got a subtitle. And here he talks about how people have, in his thesis, a horizontal identity. This might be, say, deaf culture, autistic culture, gay culture, all of these other things, and that can be separate from the identity that you might get from your parents, like a religious identity, like a Judaism kind of lens. And then he made a lot of parallels between the similarities that some of these cultures have. Some of these cultures might call themselves allies in any case, but he made some really, I guess, provocative thinking that if you are a prodigy, essentially genius level, you're in that tiny percent that actually most of the general public really don't understand what you're talking about. And that actually has quite a lot in common with, say, the culture of deaf people being misunderstood. He then actually goes on to make a kind of further leap by and a lot of this is by interviewing people on families who have had, so parents often of their children, where their children actually were involved essentially in gun killing massacres. So I think he interviewed the parents of one of the children who were involved, I think, in the Columbine school massacre or something like that. And he just drew some really interesting inferences, which I guess I hadn't really thought about, but I mean, my natural instinct would have been, there's something wrong in that family, in that education, in something like that. And he makes, I think, quite a compelling case for, actually, he said, I think this family or these parents are some of the best parents I've ever come across. That he wouldn't lay essentially really any blame on that. And then if you kind of think about that, so that probably changed my mind on that. Another book which has been quite interesting on some of these inequality things, there was one, I think, I got to remember the title because it's a riff on the Four Horsemen, but it essentially is looking at inequality through time, and actually has suggested that we've only had real convergences of equality when you've really had big, nasty things that we wouldn't want to repeat, like wars, epidemics, and things like that. So when you've had wars and epidemics, you've had this convergence in terms of equality, but actually in times of prosperity, you've always seen inequality, however you like to look at it, rise. And I guess he makes the provocative assertion that really, if you look at the last 20, 30 years of policy or whatever it is, we've not really been able to do that much about it. Arguably, we're not having any new breakthrough ideas on it. Yeah. So why wouldn't history repeat again? That inequality keeps on going up until you have something really big. And if you look at some of the things really big is, I don't think anyone would vote for them. War, epidemics, natural disasters, all of that type of things. And that was quite provocative because I hadn't understood the long historic cycle of this within that history cycle. Again, it's a bit debated, but it was quite that made me think.
What was the name of the book?
It's called The Great Leveler: Violence and the History of Inequality.
How do you self-educate? What's your preferred method of learning?
I do a lot of reading. I've always read a lot. Reading has probably been my main thing. I think we mentioned earlier before we started chatting online that I've listened to some podcasts, but I find that a lot of people can do podcasts and other things at the same time. I can't. I get stalled and I have to really listen deeply. Yeah. I guess it's the same with video and other things I know in background. So I've always been a big reader, but I'm a kind of pluralist. I think there are many ways to take input. People do it differently and find it well.
All right, Ben, how can people contact you if they would like to and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, I guess through my blog, thendobetter.com. I have said, although I'm relatively off social media, LinkedIn is probably quite a good way of reaching out to that. I accept virtually all connections and messaging there. I do have a Twitter presence, but it's currently quiet. So all of those are good ways of reaching out.
Okay, well, I will put these in the show notes. Ben Yeoh, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.